Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And we've had a slightly longer break than usual between episodes, because, well, summer, I suppose. Colin, did you get up to anything good this summer?
You know, we're in the middle of a pandemic again, and numbers are rising. And we're in a pronounced drought in Oregon, and so wildfire season is occurring again. So
yeah.
we don't travel or go do things.
Have you ever had any wildfires sort of threatening where you live directly?
Last year.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, they were 5 miles away.
Ooh, that is too close for comfort.
Do you remember the Star Trek The Next Generation episode where Dr. Crusher is trapped in the collapsing static warp bubble?
Yes.
That was my world. So,
right.
we aren't going out a lot anyway because of the coronavirus.
Yeah.
But as the wildfire smoke got progressively more and more dense, you could see shorter and shorter distances. And so you could see, several miles, and then you could see a handful of blocks. Mm-hmm. And at one point, it was across the street.
Wow. And
you couldn't see the block to any block around those to either side.
That's frightening. Last year, I interviewed the science fiction writer Howard Hendricks, and a few days after I spoke to him, his house burnt down. And he himself was a volunteer fireman. And it's a shocking thing to hear that somebody's house is burnt down, but due to a forest fire, and the person is a fireman themselves, it just sort of makes you think nobody is safe with fire around.
Yeah.
I also haven't done much this summer, except August was slightly busy for me because I was doing a fair bit of Ray Bradbury related stuff, because August is Bradbury's birthday month. I did some more of my other podcast, Bradbury 100, and a live streamed episode, which I did over Facebook, and I'm doing some preparatory work for the Bradbury Review, which is a journal, which is coming out next year. So I've been busy, but it's not been much of a summer, it's no summer activity. And in the UK, we've just had constant cloud for the whole month of August, really. 1st of September, it's the end of summer, even though it isn't technically. I always like to remind people that until we have an equinox, or is it a solstice? It's a solstice, isn't it? Till we have one of those, the season hasn't changed. But I know, come 1st of September, it's autumn. Now, last time I mentioned more or less in passing 2001, A Space Odyssey, because I'd been reading the making of book by, Michael Benson. And that sent me off on a 2001 rewatch and a reread of the novel. And I also reread Arthur C. Clarke's book, The Lost Worlds of 2001, which is a kind of collection of bits of ideas that he wrote, but never made it into the film, or never made it into the novel. And I know, Colin, you've seen the film and you've read the book, right?
Both, yes. We covered it in my other podcast.
Yeah, so I thought maybe we could compare notes on our experiences with 2001. And what prompted me to even read the making of book in the first place is really that this is 2021. So 2001 was 20 years ago, even though the film, of course, was made in 1968. But the events of the film, if they were real, would now be 20 years in our past. And I just thought this is a good time to reconsider. So what's your experience with 2001? For instance, when was the first time you saw the film or read the book?
I think the first time... Well, I know the first time I watched the film, it would have been in the 80s. Mm-hmm. We rented it on VHS from the local video store, none of which things exist currently any longer. And I probably read the book shortly afterwards, because the local library in Cottage Grove was pretty well stocked with science fiction. Yeah.
So it was film first and book second for you.
Mm-hmm. And I remember being fascinated by the movie, just enraptured by the special effects and the story and everything else.
I had a similar experience. My first experience of it, though, was on television, broadcast television. I don't remember whether it was broadcast before VCRs existed or whether it was simply that we didn't have a VCR, but I know it was broadcast on British TV sometime, I'm going to say in the 1980s, although I couldn't swear to the year. I could probably look it up somewhere, but I couldn't swear to the year. Sometime in the 1980s, it was shown on one of our main TV channels. And of course, in those days, this was the days of cathode ray tube televisions, which were 4:3, none of your widescreen stuff that we have now. And of course, 2001 is a very wide film. And how on earth do you show that? How do you show a widescreen film on a more or less square TV? And I distinctly remember that what the BBC did when they showed it, and this was the first time it had ever been shown on British TV, they letterboxed it. So, you had those black bars, top and bottom of the screen, and the film was running across the middle of the screen. But into the black bars, they put stars to try and make it look as if the star field in the film continued off the edges. And they'd never done that before for a film, and it was very controversial, and lots of people complained. Why did you do this? Why not just show it in a letterbox like normal? But when I look back, that was a very weird way of watching the film, because it clearly is not designed for television. It's not designed to be watched anywhere that you can be distracted, because there are so many things in it where I think you can lose patience or your attention can wander. Do you know what I mean? There's some slow passages, for example, and lots of unexplained passages.
Yeah. So when I podcasted about this, nigh on 30 years after I'd first seen it, we get together, the three of us, and we watch it all together. And I was bored.
Wow.
And so I was struggling with this idea. I had admired the movie and enjoyed it and read the book, and I knew that they were different in some ways. And then I watch it now, and I'm like, this is boring. I mean, there are times where I turn on NASA television and watch a spacewalk or a repair, but it doesn't hold my full attention because, how long can you watch somebody turning a screwdriver or pulling a wrench? And there are several long sequences in the movie where, that's exactly what's happening.
Yeah. It's strange, isn't it? How a film can grip us. Because your first exposure to it sounds like you were fascinated by it and you were really drawn into it. But then, decades later, the same film, the same you, obviously you've had life experience in between, but it completely flips over into being something else for you. Do you think it'll ever flip back? Can you conceive that it might one day fascinate you again?
It's possible. And since the podcast and since you mentioned we were going to be talking about this, I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it is about me that might be different, or why I don't appreciate it as much as I do the book, because I still enjoy the book. And I think it's that I don't strongly appreciate the visual media.
Right. Yeah.
So going to an art museum, not really my thing. The ambiguity that the movie brings is similar to the ambiguity in the movie Joker with Joaquin Phoenix. Yeah. And I can appreciate the visual design and the elements. The special effects were incredible, even being 50 years old. But yeah, I think between the pacing and the ambiguity that Kubrick was intentionally hoping to get, it just doesn't reach me.
I have to say, when I most recently watched it, I was drawn into it much more than I expected to be. I know the first time I ever saw it, I was completely enraptured by it, although I found the first sequence of the film too long and too boring, and I kind of wanted it to go faster. But it was on live TV, there was no way of fast forwarding it or skipping it or anything like that. You just had to take it as it was. I know sometime after that it was broadcast again on TV and I recorded it, and every now and again I would rewatch the VHS. So this probably in the 1990s I was watching the VHS, and every time I would watch it I would tend to skip through the ape sequence at the beginning. And I think it's because it's quite long and drawn out, and there's very little in that sequence that you need to know. The whole point of that sequence, it seems to me, is apes encounter this thing, this monolith, and are suddenly transformed into something else. And that's all you need to know. But Kubrick takes about 40 minutes to do that. So in the days of VHS, I would fast forward through that. And when I got the DVD, when it first came out, it was a very bare bones DVD. When I would rewatch it, I would tend to go to the next chapter, and then the next chapter, until I got to the scene where these ape men, whatever they are, were touching the monolith. And that's when the film begins to come to life, I think, at that point. The time most recently when I watched it, and the thing that made me watch it again, was that I got a 4K Blu-ray version of it. And I don't have a 4K TV, but I have an HD TV, and it looks beautiful. But I found that I could watch it at normal speed without skipping, and I was quite drawn into it. And I think it's because the Blu-ray rendering of it just is flawless. Normally, when you get a film that is of that age, and you buy it on a new medium, you can see the flaws. I've got loads of Blu-rays of films from the 1960s where there's lots of film grain, and sometimes it doesn't digitize very well. But 2001 looks almost grainless. You know, it's really, technically it holds up really well. And I find, therefore, I'm lost in the film, and I forget to step back and look for the how it was made of it. Usually when I'm watching a film, I'm sort of hovering between enjoying the story and figuring out how they made it. But with this viewing, I was drawn right in, and I wasn't considering how it was made, even though I'd just read the making of book. So for me, it's still a very engaging film, remarkably so.
Yeah, what a gift to be given, to have nothing in the presentation of the film that pulls you away from the enjoyment of the film.
Yes.
You know, I have, in the last month, I've been rereading some old Andre Norton fantasy books from the Witch World series. Mm-hmm. And I don't know when they were digitized and made into ebooks, but they are full of scanning errors.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And it becomes really obvious that no one took the time to carefully read through and make sure that letters weren't transliterated or adjacent letters weren't joined into a new letter that makes the word nonsensical. Mm. And for me, those things pull me right out of a book.
Now, I expect to see those things if they are kind of pirated versions of a book, but it is shocking how many commercial ebooks are just really bad scans. And it's as if they're expecting the readers to spot the mistakes and report them.
In the past, I've tried reporting them, and nothing happens. And I think it's because they either have an acceptable error rate, or the amount of sales of the book don't cover the cost of correcting and republishing to all of the endpoints, to Barnes & Noble and Amazon and who knows who else.
Oh, that's terrible. What about the book? I think you said you saw the film first and then read the book. And I think that's the order that worked for me as well. I think I saw the film first and then read the book. I might have read Jerome Agel's Making of 2001 before I'd seen the film, because I was fascinated by the film even when I hadn't seen it, because there was this kind of mystery about it, because it had never been on TV. And so there was a kind of a mystique around the film before I'd seen it. And I think I'd read the making of book before I'd seen the film, and then I saw the film, and then I read the novel. But what was your experience with the book?
The book, they're very close. Mm-hmm. And for people that are listening and don't know this, the novel and the movie were co-developed.
Yeah.
I think the novel got frozen a little earlier than the movie because the movie evolved some things. For example, in the book, they go to Saturn. In the movie, they go to Jupiter, and that's because of special effects problems. They couldn't make convincing rings.
Yes.
So there are some subtle differences. The other thing is, because it's a book, there's a lot of specificity. So if you watch the movie, that sequence that you skip over about the early hominids, in the book it explains what the monolith has is a character in the book in the beginning. And it is there to do certain things to the hominids, to test and improve and do other things. And that specificity made it way more interesting and relatable to me. And that happens throughout the book.
Yeah. I think, if I remember rightly, I did reread the novel recently, but some passages I read very quickly, so I didn't linger over them. Is this how you remember it? When the monolith first appears, it's more of a teaching machine, it's as if the ape men can see imagery and stuff sort of projected or visible within the monolith. Is that how you remember it? Or is that part of what was left out of the book?
No, that's in the book. So
Right.
they were taught to tie knots and do other physical things, and it was like, are they dexterous enough to do these things and learn them in these tasks? And at one point, the tribe is being attacked by a wildcat.
Mm-hmm.
And I might be stretching here. The monolith teaches one of the hominids how to defend itself.
Yep.
And then teaches it that, you can make weapons and then defend yourself and take food and water and resources, prevent your resources from being stolen by another tribe.
Yeah.
And at that point, the monolith vanishes. Its task has been accomplished.
Some people have said that if you watch the film and then read the book will explain what you've just seen in the film. And I think that is true to an extent. But I think what's actually happening is because Kubrick and Clarke worked on the book first and developed their ideas in the form of a novel, when it came to filming, what Kubrick did is he then abstracted from that. And
Yes.
so kind of found minimal ways of conveying the same idea. So with the teaching machine, he evidently decided not to show the actual teaching in detail, but merely to show it as a kind of a cause and effect process. So in other words, you see the curiosity of the ape men, you see the monolith, they touch the monolith, and after they've touched the monolith, they are transformed and they begin to behave differently. So he's showing things in a very simple cause and effect way, but because there's no verbalizing of what's happening, some people don't trust themselves as viewers to understand what they've just witnessed. And I think that's one of the curious things about the film. I think it is both the strength of the film that it is non-verbal most of the time. It's a distinct strength because very few films do that. Mm-hmm. But it's also a weakness of the film because most viewers don't get it. At least that first section. They think, what is this? This is just apes jumping around. But no, if you look at it, it's quite simply a cause and effect. They see the monolith, they touch it, whoa, they're transformed. They do things differently, and then they learn how to make weapons and all of that. So it is quite simple cause and effect storytelling. And as I was watching it most recently, it occurred to me that the plot of the film is probably the simplest plot there has ever been. Because, well, there's very few characters. There are very few transformative moments in the plot where the story shifts direction. And you could list those on a very small piece of paper. You could write it on a post-it note, the plot of the film. Mm-hmm. And yet, it feels this big, colossal thing because everything is done so slowly. The visual effects are on such a grand scale. I just think it is a masterpiece. But it's also one of the least communicative films of all time, or at least the viewer doesn't have the confidence that they understand it.
Well, I think in that abstract way that he does so well. Mm-hmm. Let me throw in a contrast. Mm. If you have watched The Fast and the Furious, you know everything is spelled out for you. It is a completely passive experience.
Yes.
Movies, and they're more, I'm going to call them art movies for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
They require a higher level of participation.
Yes.
And because I think they're a little more vague and abstract, you can bring your own meaning to it. And that meaning is just as valid as anyone else's. And the magic of it are in the the thoughts that you have. Well, what if it was this, and what if it was that, and the conversations that you have with other people because of it.
And that's part of the beauty of the shared experience of watching a film. But yeah, I absolutely agree with you. When you're watching something that doesn't explain itself, as a viewer, you're kind of speculating. Oh, maybe that ape did that because of this. And what you then do, sometimes you do this consciously, sometimes unconsciously, having speculated on why X did Y, you then look for confirmation that your speculation is correct. And then something else happens and you think, yes, that confirms what I was thinking. So the film watching process is a process of speculation, hypothesizing, looking for evidence, and then confirming that your hunch was correct in the first place. And that, as you say, is a very active engagement that encourages. And yeah, I don't think I've ever seen any of the Fast and the Furious films, but I kind of know what they're like, even though I've never seen them, because I've seen the trailers, I've seen the publicity, and I can completely imagine that they're the type of film where you don't have to do any of that thinking at all, none of that speculating, because it serves it all up to you in a sort of obvious way.
You could do a little speculation as to the motives of the characters.
Yeah.
But even then, everything is, you understand why this character does this because he has done things like this in the past, and
Yes.
and so forth.
Yeah. What about the different sections of the film? As I was watching it most recently, and again reading the novel again, there are really 4 distinct sections to the film. You've got the sort of the ape man sequence. Mm-hmm. You've then got the trip into space and the trip to the moon. Then you've got the business around Jupiter, where we've got the 2 lone astronauts and the rest of the crew are in hibernation. And then you've got the final trip, which is Dave Bowman on his own, the famous psychedelic travel sequence that happens, and then he ends up in this period hotel room or something. But there are 4 distinct sections to it. How do you have different reactions to each section? Is there any one part of the film that you engage with more?
Personally, I engage more with the second and the third sections because it's more like classic science fiction.
Right, yeah.
And it's a little more of our time, so to say.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's multinationalism, there's, astronauts going in a ship. These are things that, everyone's familiar with these days. Yeah. The early hominids, especially in the movie where things are a little more slower paced and vague, not so much. Mm-hmm. And then the complete, literally out of this world trip that Bowman takes and what happens to him inside the monolith are just, they're way, way out there.
Do you feel that the final section of the film sort of gives answers, or do you feel that it's just piling more and more mystery, one mystery on top of another?
You can see what's happening to Bowman, but you don't understand what it is. Mm. And you don't understand the purpose of it. Why is this happening? Now, I have I'll call it benefit for lack of another word. I've read all 4 books in the series.
You've got one up on me. I've only read the first 2. No, I've read 3. I've read 3 of them.
So yeah, I know what's happening in that final sequence because of what's told in other books. And so, I have brought meaning back to the original movie because of that. Yeah. Rather than saying, and going through that process that I talked about, well, I wonder what's going on and why is it going on? And
does it feel like a real series to you, or does it feel like here's an author who's just going to write another one of these because he can? Because that's how I felt.
I think that 2010 was a good sequel.
Mm-hmm.
2061, is that the third book?
Yeah.
That felt more like, I could do this. Mm-hmm. And then 3001 is like, I better put a bow on this because this is the way I want to end it.
I haven't read that one. I got a bit sick with 2061. I just felt it was nothing. But yeah, I agree with you about 2010. Actually, I thought that was a good solid book in its own right. And this doesn't come from my reading of the book so much as from reading what Clarke said about the book. But I remember him saying that there were some for him, some niggling issues that were left unanswered by 2001, and there came a point where he'd accumulated so many things that he felt needed addressing that there was the need for another book now. And it feels like that when you read the book. It feels like the book has a purpose. It is addressing some things that have been left either unsaid or unfinished. So I agree with 2010, but 2061 just seemed like a way of making some money. And so I didn't bother with the one that followed that.
It's got an interesting premise. In 2010, we're left with a second son.
Yeah.
And the warning not to go to Europa.
Yes.
And in the science fiction questioning that we've talked about, what if? The question is, what if somebody went to Europa? What's going to happen? But
it felt to me as if the "Don't Go to Europa" was setting up a sequel, because 2010 could have ended some other way. But because it leaves you with this instruction of not to do a thing. It's like telling a child not to touch something. They're going to touch it. So it felt like that's what he was doing with that. He was putting something in there that there's got to be a mission to Europa now, because he said don't go. So just going back to the 4 sections of the film, you were most drawn to the space sections. And I think I probably always have been as well, because it is such a near perfect representation of what it's like to be in space. The depiction of gravity, or the lack of. When they built the interior of the circular space station, they built it with a curved floor. And then when we see the Discovery, there's this big centrifuge that provides the artificial gravity. Mm-hmm. And just the idea of making a film set that does that, this gigantic hamster wheel that they created, that is one hell of a commitment to a simple idea of let's show people how you would have to do this if you wanted gravity. In real life, we've discovered that it's actually easier to get around without gravity, and that's why no space station ever built has had rotating components, because why bother? It's actually easier to float. But the sheer hubris of realizing that you can have artificial gravity, but in order to have it you have to do this, and now we're going to build one of these just to prove it. I just think that's magnificent. And I wish more films would do that, to more filmmakers. Obviously it'd cost a fortune. And I still think all of that stuff holds up remarkably well. There's 1 or 2 moments in the visual effects that don't hold up today, but the vast majority of it does. And I have to say, some of the visual effects I expected to look terrible on Blu-ray because they looked a bit dodgy on DVD. But in fact, on 4K Blu-ray, there are no flaws there at all. I think in some of the earlier releases, some of the visual effects had kind of digital artifacts around them that made them not look very convincing. But now we've got much higher resolution on the Blu-ray and the 4K. Those flaws have gone away.
Yeah, it makes me wonder whether or not they've invested quite a bit of time digitally cleaning all those things up. It's a labor of love.
Yeah, possibly. This is a sacrilegious thought. But we've seen lots of films remade over the years. Can you conceive of 2001 ever being remade?
No. and yet, I know that those big dollar signs are floating out there for someone, right?
Especially since there are 3 other books in a series, which are, there's a franchise waiting to be exploited. So you would think somebody might have had the idea of doing it. But no, I think it's a horrifying thought of remaking it, because it could never be the same thing. I think you could make a new film which is an adaptation of Clarke's novel and do it maybe more in the style of the film of 2010, but I think it would be foolish to try and remake 2001. What it represents is such a transformation of the science fiction field. When you look at science fiction films before 2001, and then you look at 2001, it really stands out as being something very, very different. It's very different to Forbidden Planet, very different to Destination Moon. It has a far greater commitment to realism. It has a far more mature attitude to its subject than anything that went before. Even the things that followed it never lived up to what 2001 did, but at least 2001 showed you that there are some things you can do in film if you're prepared to spend money and commit to it. Mostly in the visual effects.
Well, and the storytelling.
Yeah, yes, of course, yeah. And I think it's probably true of all Kubrick's films that none of Kubrick's films should ever be remade. But I'm acutely aware that most of Kubrick's films were based on books. So at some point somebody is going to readapt the source material. But then whatever they make is going to be compared to the Kubrick adaptation.
Yeah, and I don't see that being a positive thing. Well, even Gone with the Wind or Citizen Kane. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversaries of those. And they're still in our cultural context. Because what I was thinking was, maybe after 2001 the movie has fallen off into history long enough people would want to see a readaptation of it. But maybe at that point there are so many other things to make that's not an idea that would work. 2001
shows no sign of going away. You know, every time a new medium comes along, so VHS it was sold on, DVD it was sold on, Blu-ray, and then 4K Blu-ray. You know, every time it's been reissued in a new format, it's enabled us to see the film much closer to what it is meant to be. I mean, ideally we'd see it on big screens. I've never seen it on a big screen. I've only ever seen it on a TV. But with each iteration, we're seeing it closer and closer to what it was originally. And I don't think you can really get any better than 4K because there is no more detail in the image to be revealed by going any further than 4K. But, you know, every time it's re-released, it seems to do well. And it seems to get positive reviews and people praising it. And, you know, the next generation of filmmakers saying, yes, this has influenced me, and so on. So I think it's really stood the test of time in that respect. Unlike some other films of that era. I looked up some of the other films from the same year. Mm-hmm. And in that same year, 1968, well, in the UK, we had Quatermass and the Pit, 1967. In the States, it was released as 5 Million Years to Earth in 1968. So that sort of counts as being the same year. Now that film works well. It's a Hammer film, but it looks aged. You know, it looks of its time. There's Charlie, which is based on Flowers for Algernon, which I haven't seen for a while, but the last time I looked at it, that looked very, very 60s. It looked very dated. There's something about the presentation of it that I find it difficult to engage with. It feels like that needs to be remade, and indeed it has been remade. Mm-hmm. Also that year you've got The Illustrated Man, which was never a very good film to begin with, and again looks like the filmmakers were taking something. And then you've got Planet of the Apes, which holds up, but in a kind of, well, this was pre-CGI, so you've got to forgive it somewhat, you know. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the storytelling of most of those films, but none of those have really had a recurring life with subsequent releases. Possibly Planet of the Apes, there's still a sort of a big following for that. But most of the films of that year, science fictional films anyway, have just sort of faded off into memory.
You know, 2001 has the other famous note in that it's alleged to be part of the moon conspiracy.
Oh, yes.
People say, you know, look at Kubrick's movie and how beautiful that is, and that's certainly better quality than what we saw NASA telling us, and so, you know, why should we believe that they really made it to the moon? And people who are Kubrick fans say, you're right, Kubrick could have done that, but he's such a perfectionist, he would have required them to go to the moon to make it.
Yes, I've heard that one. That's great, isn't it? And actually, having read the making of book by Michael Benson, I am newly reminded how much a perfectionist Kubrick was, but primarily he was a problem solver. He liked to have problems that he could come up with a solution to, but he didn't always know what the solution was, so he needed people around him to come up with ideas and present him with multiple solutions so he could pick one and run with it. And that's a very rare thing, but it's also very rare for anybody to give money to a filmmaker who operates that way, because that's a very expensive way of making a film. The cheaper way is to write the script and lock the script and then move forward into production. But Kubrick was developing the script, building sets, building models, doing all of these things simultaneously. And that's a very risky business. And I think it's remarkable that he was able to produce a film that made money. But he did, apparently.
Well, and it's a successful technique. That's almost exactly what Peter Jackson did for the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
True. Yes.
You know, a lot of these things were, well, this set isn't ready yet, so let's go film something onto the next set. And the concept of filming all 3 movies concurrently, working together like that for 14 months is,
yeah,
well, it was unprecedented.
Yeah, yeah. So if Arthur C. Clarke had got his act together and written the 3 sequels to 2001, he could have got Kubrick to make films of all of them.
That's interesting.
What a feast that would have been.
Yeah.
What about some of the things that have sort of been inspired by 2001? So obviously there's 2010, which I think is subtitled The Year We Made Contact. Mm-hmm. There's the TV series Space 1999, which not the storytelling of it, because I think it's in a very much lower league than 2001, but the look of Space 1999 is very much influenced by 2001. There's Duncan Jones's film Moon, Interstellar, although I've never been able to get past the first 20 minutes of that film, so I couldn't swear to that. And also, I think part of the film Contact, you know, based on the Carl Sagan book, parts of that, I think, are influenced by 2001, especially the idea of the sort of the ultimate trip. Things that have come in the wake of 2001. Do you think there's anything that's anywhere near as good?
Oh my, that's a question.
Mm.
Well, certainly Moon's... Anytime you take science fiction, you have a bunch of options to make, a bunch of decisions to make about how realistic you're going to make it. And it directly affects, 1, your budget, but 2, the environment that your actors have to be in. And I think the more realistic it is, the better a performance they're going to get out of them. If you watch interviews with actors today, everyone enjoys the visual presentation of what people can make with a green screen, but they talk about how incredibly difficult it is to act against nothing. And so I'm a big proponent of physical props, which Kubrick, that was his only choice, but he did it with an extremely high quality.
Yeah. Actually, you say that was his only choice, but in some cases that isn't strictly true. So, for example, all of the displays within the spaceships, those could have been put in post-production, even in those days.
Okay.
But Kubrick decided to have them as being real screens. And with the technology of the day, any time you see a screen in 2001 with moving images on it, there's a 16mm projector under there with a loop of film playing. And so, the set of the Discovery had something like 64 16mm projectors all running. So it was really noisy when they were filming in there because all these things were running.
Wow.
So there were choices that could have allowed him to do it another way, but doing it in post would have looked cheesy. And he chose to go for hyper-realism. And the consequence is you have to do it in this clunky mechanical way because that's all they had in 68 or 64 when they started the film. But yeah, I take your point, and I think part of even though the performances in 2001 are famously flat, I think they're flat because the characters are supposed to be flat, not because they're bad actors, but because the characters are supposed to be very, very calm, very rational. But I think the actors were only able to do that because the environment they were in was so real. Mm-hmm. Like that whole centrifuge existed. They built the whole damn thing. And they put the actor inside. They closed the two sides of the centrifuge together, so the actor was literally encased in the giant hamster wheel. In there is the camera, which sits on a tripod that stays where it is when the wheel turns, and there's a kind of a slot in the bottom of the hamster wheel, so that as the wheel turns, it bypasses the camera. And meanwhile, Kubrick and his crew are sitting outside of this spinning wheel, watching things on a monitor and directing through, I don't know, a walkie-talkie or something. That must have been such an uncannily real experience for the actors, and I can't help but think that informs their performance, because they feel like they're really there.
Yeah, well, and astronauts were military people, highly trained. If they had listened to any of the recordings of talks between Houston and the astronauts, it was always calm, controlled. There was a little bit of joking and laughing, but it's nowhere near as casual, even as the way we're talking now.
And that reminds me, there's one little sequence in the film where the two astronauts send a message to Mission Control, and then Mission Control send a message back to them. And it's a very mechanical, militaristic man who comes on the screen and gives them their response. And he was an actual air traffic controller. And they paid him to say these lines. And that's exactly right. It just feels so mechanical and militaristic, but completely non-threatening, because it's not a military mission.
But anyway, you asked about movies.
Yes.
Moon was a great story, tragic, but I think completely real and plausible. So there's one actor that plays several parts. That's all I'll say about that. And he has no one to act against. It's just him on the moon. Amazing, great acting job, incredible science fiction,
and mostly sort of physical effects as well. If I remember rightly, they use miniature effects, models and stuff, rather than CGI, even though they could have used CGI. So that was a kind of a design choice.
Yeah, and I enjoy Contact a lot, because it is a question of science and faith instead of science versus faith. So I love the story. I love the content, and the effects are okay. And I think it's a good movie. It's a decent adaptation of the original work.
I actually think the film is better than the book in this case, simply because Sagan isn't really a novelist. So the novel is a bit clunky.
It could do some screw tightening and some bolt cranking and a few other things. But
Colin, I don't have a quiz this week. Do you have anything?
I do have a quiz, and I found this quiz, and I thought this is perfect for Phil. You are in the visual arts, and you are a big Star Trek fan.
Oh dear.
So I'm going to paste the URL to this in Facebook, so you know how to find it, and then as you bring it up, I'll bring it up, and I'll kind of talk through it, and I think you're just going to cruise right through these and have a good time.
Okay, I just need to move to my keyboard. Okay, so Colin has given me the link, and it says something like, how well do you remember the colours of Star Trek?
Yes, so what this quiz is, I believe there's 8 frames, and these people have taken individual images of Star Trek and decolorized certain parts of it, and then you are going to be asked to identify on a 1-by-1 case basis the correct color that should be used in that frame. For example, and this first one is really pretty easy. The question is, what color is Spock's uniform? Is it red, yellow, or blue? Very good.
Now, just before I click on that, obviously I recommend people play along with this at home, but as I look at the image, it as you say, it's been decolorized. So we've got Kirk and Spock, and it is a full color picture, except Spock's jersey is grey in this image. So I have to choose the color. So of course I'm going to choose blue.
Yes.
Which is correct. Then we've got what colour is Captain Kirk's tunic in Charlie X. And it gives you a visual representation of the 3 colours. And this is fantastic. I mean, this is Photoshop 101, I have to say. This is replace colour in Photoshop. But this is great fun. So I'm choosing green, and I am correct. Khan wore 2 vibrant tunics in Space Seed. What colours are they? Oh my god. Silver and gold, blue and green, red and yellow, red and green. Oh dear, I'm going to have to sit and think about this one. I feel there was some red involved, so I'm going to go red and yellow. And I am correct.
Hey, you're 3 for 3 so far. You're doing great.
I have to say, this quiz is great for radio. And the next one, which crew member is a red shirt? These are full colour images, except the shirts, well actually, and the hands of the actors have been decoloured, so they're just grey. Now I think the one on the right I recognise, and I think that is from the episode The Galileo 7, and I think that guy wears a blue shirt. I'm pretty sure. And so of the other two, it's a toss-up because I don't recognise them particularly. I'm going to say the one on the left is a red shirt. Oh, and I'm correct.
Oh, man. When I took this, I thought that because he had a tricorder that he was part of the science division.
Ah. Now, funny, that thought did cross my mind, but I also thought that what often happens with these red shirts, the ones who get killed, is they usually do have something. They usually have a weapon, or they have something, because it's as if the director knows that they're not going to be around for long, so we'll give them something specific rather than just standing there. So that's partly what drew me to him. This looks really good on the radio. The next one is Kirk holds 2 tribbles at the end of the Trouble with Tribbles. What colour are they? Well, I think one of them is sort of brown. So maybe they're both brown, so that's what I'm going to choose. And that's correct. Very good. And what colour is Edith's hat in The City on the Edge of Forever? And we're presented with 3 visual presentations there. I think the one on the right, where it's sort of yellowy, browny, orangey, sort of looks more correct somehow. Nah, I'm wrong. So which one is it?
It is the cream one on the far left.
Oh, that just looked drained of colour, so I thought that can't be it.
I thought it'd be blue because it kind of matches her eyes.
Ah. What colour is Kirk's flannel shirt in the same episode? Well, I'm sure that's red. We've got him here in a blue and is that a green one and a red one? I'm sure it's red. Although I have to say, I have one that is very similar to that blue one. But I think it's red. Yes, phew. So that's not very good, is it? So I'm not really as much of a Trekkie as I claim to be. Or I'm not as much of a visual person as I claim to be.
Or you're in need of a Star Trek rewatch just to make sure everything's fresh in your memory again.
Or I'm colourblind, or the colours on my monitor are not representative of reality. So
I never considered that. That you might be colorblind. It's never ever... Yeah, we never talked about that. Wow, I got lucky.
Yeah, that should have been question 1. Are you colourblind?
Yes or colorblind? No? All right.
Well, thank you for that. That's the world's best radio quiz there. Guess the colour. Almost as good as back in the day when they had Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy doing ventriloquism on the radio. Now, shall we have a quick run-through of past, present and future? Any recommended old science fiction that you want to pass on this week?
Well, I had mentioned that I have been rereading Andre Norton's fantasy series, Witch World. Mm-hmm. So it's from the 60s. It kind of predates a lot of our modern fantasy. It's incredible. It's thought-inspiring. It's fun. And it's very, very different from modern epic fantasy. At least to have an idea of, how a grandmaster of science fiction writes, I recommend people go and give it a quick read. Pick any of the books in the series. Most of them are standalone, and give it a read.
I don't think I've read any of those, actually. Maybe I should pick one up at some point. I've got a couple of things to recommend. These are really quite random. I've got quite a few reference books, and one that I found I've sort of gone to 2 or 3 times in the last week, is a book. The version I've got is called the Aurum Film Encyclopedia Volume 2, Science Fiction. Now, it's a film encyclopedia, and this one is edited by Phil Hardy. I believe it was published under other names, so there may be other versions out there. But the curious thing about this as a film encyclopedia is that it's chronological rather than alphabetical. So you can choose a year, and then you can read about all the science fiction films that were released in that year. And I think that's a fascinating way of doing things, because we often forget about the context in which a film is made. So to be able to look at a film and see what other films came before it, what other films come after it, I think that's quite useful. So that's the Aurum Film Encyclopedia. The version I've got was published in, I think, about 1985. And I don't know that they ever did a revision to it. But if you see one in a library, it's well worth having a look.
Excellent.
The other past one, it's not really science fiction, is a book I picked up by Robert Bloch, and it's called Firebug. And it's sort of about a journalist investigating some strange sort of cultish behaviour that goes on. I haven't actually read the whole thing yet, but I've started reading it. What led me to it is I saw a posting somewhere where somebody pointed out that the first chapter of the book, even though it's a Robert Bloch novel, the first chapter was actually written by Harlan Ellison. And now I'd heard that sometime in the past, but I never looked at the book, so I thought I'd go and buy a copy, so I did. And it's interesting so far, what I've read of it. I quite like Robert Bloch, but he's a bit cheap and cheerful sometimes as a writer. But he's usually quite engaging. So that's Firebug.
I've heard of books being co-written by authors, but never where one author started it and then handed it off to a second.
Yeah. Well, actually, it worked the other way around. Bloch wrote the novel and submitted it to the publisher. I can't remember the name of the publisher, but Ellison was the editor for the publisher at the time. This is, I think, 1961. And Ellison decided he wanted to buy the book and publish it, but it was short, and it was, I don't know, 2,000 words shorter than they normally would publish. I can't remember how it happened, but for some reason Bloch was unable to do any more material, so Ellison offered to write a kind of a preamble. So there's an introductory chapter that introduces the character, and that's by Ellison. It's not credited, so, nowhere on the book does it say that, but it is a fact. It is no secret, and it is a very good introductory chapter, and it's probably the best part of the book, to be honest, but I haven't read all of it, so I'll get back to you on that.
Okay.
What about present stuff? Anything sort of new or current?
My library has an RSS feed of all the new books that are coming in, and they're of all ages, but I was taken by the title of a book, which happens rather frequently. It's called How to Invent Everything, a survival guide for the stranded time traveler.
Oh, great.
So I think it's going to be this mix of science fiction and actual science, and I'm very intrigued by it. It reminds me of the book What If by Randall Munroe, and it's pure science fiction backed by scientific fact. The first question that he asks is, what would happen if you threw a baseball at the speed of light? And as an ex-NASA engineer, he goes through and shows, about the energy involved and what happens when that kind of energy is contained in a small space and what happens to the things around it and in front of it and behind it. So it's a fun read. It's pure enjoyment.
Excellent. My present one I would recommend. I picked this up the other day, and I've only started dipping into it. I haven't read much of it yet, but there is a free book out there. It's a PDF, totally free, from Brittle Paper, and it's called African Futurism, an Anthology, edited by Wally Talabi. And what it is stories from writers all over the African continent. Now, a few episodes ago, I recommended a magazine which does a similar thing, publishes science fiction from African writers. But this is specifically African futurism. So it is science fiction, but it's future science fiction rather than sort of contemporary stuff. And it's from writers all over the continent. Many of them are known and published, and some of them are award-winning. So there's some good stuff in there. Nnedi Okorafor is in there, Dilman Dila is in there, Rafayat Aliyu is in there, and a load of others. I can't say that I'm an expert on any of these writers, but I do like reading science fiction that is not from the British or American tradition. I've mostly read British and American stuff, but I do like to read stuff from outside. So the odd bit of Chinese science fiction, Russian science fiction, or in this case, African science fiction. So it's a free book, African Futurism, an Anthology. It's a PDF, and I'll put a link on the blog so that people can download it from brittle paper.
Interesting.
Oh, the other present thing, there's this series of books called These Are the Voyages. And they're published by a guy, or written by a guy called Mark Cushman, and they're sort of self-published. And they tell the complete story of Star Trek based on archival research that Cushman does. Now, I'm not recommending the whole series, but the one I'm reading at the moment, it's a very thick book, and it's called These Are the Voyages, Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek in the 1970s. Now, anyone who knows anything about Star Trek knows that there was no Star Trek in the 1970s until Star Trek the Motion Picture, which came out in 1979. So why on earth is there a thick book about this non-existent period? Well, the reason is because Gene Roddenberry was very active in the 70s, trying to get things made and making loads of pilot films for TV, which were supposed to lead to series but never did. And although there have been other books about Roddenberry and what he was doing in the 70s, this gives far more detail than I've ever seen before. And it's given me a new respect for Roddenberry, because he was a lot busier than I thought he was. Because in the whole of the 70s, there's probably only about 4 or 5 things that actually got made and had his name on them. But he did loads of other stuff that's just not known. So I've found this quite a fascinating read. It's a real doorstop of a book. But anyone who's interested in Roddenberry and what he might have done other than Star Trek, that seems to have been his most fertile period during the 1970s. So it's an interesting book to look at. In fact, this is volume 2. So there was one before this about the 70s. There's this one that I'm reading, and I think there's a third one also about Roddenberry in the 70s. So, there's enough to fill 3 very thick books.
Wow.
Who knew? My overall impression, by the way, is that after reading all these books about Roddenberry, he was not a great writer. He had some good ideas, and he was a very good story analyst, but he was not really a great writer. He wrote a couple of good scripts in his career, but an awful lot of really clunky stuff. And so it's given me a whole new appreciation of what he was. He was more of an ideas man than a writer. But anyway, that's my present reading. What about the future? Have you heard about anything coming up in the near future that interests you?
Nothing that I haven't already talked about.
Okay, that's fair enough. I struggled a bit finding something for this, I must admit. But I did a quick Google before we began today, just to look for TV series that are being produced currently or due for release in the next year. And there's quite a few things in development, most of which are quite formulaic, I think. But there's one that intrigued me, so I've made a note of this and I shall keep an eye out for this. Station 11. Don't know if you've heard of that. A 2014 novel by Emily St. John Mandel. It's set in the Great Lakes region, and it's about a fictional pandemic, a swine flu pandemic, which is in the book referred to as Georgia flu.
Yep.
And are you familiar with it?
I've read it.
Ah, yeah. Now, I've not read it, but I know that it won the Arthur C. Clarke Award in 2015 and maybe some other awards as well. And there's going to be an HBO miniseries from it. So what do you know of the book? I mean, what do you recall of the book?
It's told across multiple timelines at the same time. Mm-hmm. The core of the story is, like you said, there's been a pandemic and how that changes the world. And I'm going to say the main thread of the story is about a traveling group of minstrels who do music and do plays, and you get to see the world through their eyes.
And can you imagine it as being a mini-series? Does it feel like that is the correct form for it?
I think you could boil it down and do a movie, but as a mini-series, it's going to be much richer, especially if they keep to the idea of the book, which is about the experience of the people and the decisions that they make and the decisions that they made, which brought them to where they are.
Mm-hmm. Whenever you hear about these things, it's always tempting to think, I'll just read the book before I watch the show so that I can see whether the show is any good. But I think in this instance, because I haven't read the book, and I do like a nice pandemic drama, I have to say. So, although it's a bit too close to home at present, I think. But no, nevertheless, I'll give it a go. It's not clear when it's coming out, and that makes me wonder whether it's had some problems or isn't very good or something. But I gather that they finished shooting about a month or so ago, so I would imagine it's going to come out sometime in the next 12 months. I think that's it, Colin, unless you've got anything else.
Nope, I'm pretty wrapped for this month.
Okay, so let's, as usual, say thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kuskie. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look out for the show notes on our website 101sf.blogspot.com, and also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. And finally, please subscribe wherever you find us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Listen Notes, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.